She cried for help in the rain. The next day, she revealed a secret that changed everything. The rain had begun as a distant whisper against the windshield, almost gentle, like the first hesitant notes of a song. But within minutes, the sky had darkened into an impenetrable grey mass, and the whisper had become a furious roar. Olivia Harper tightened her grip on the steering wheel as the wipers struggled to keep up. Each sweep seemed slower than the last, smearing water across the glass rather than clearing it. The narrow rural road ahead twisted and vanished into walls of rain, forcing her to ease off the accelerator. She had been driving for hours, making her way from a business meeting in a small Midwest town back toward the city, preferring the quiet of these back roads to the relentless pace of the highway. It was supposed to be a peaceful detour, a chance to breathe away from the sharp edges of boardrooms and the constant ringing of her phone. But now, the silence she had once appreciated felt oppressive, filled only by the pounding rain and the low growl of thunder rolling across the hills. A flash of lightning tore through the dark clouds, illuminating a landscape of bare trees swaying violently, their skeletal branches bending under the wind's force. Olivia's car jolted as a gust struck from the side. She clenched her jaw and pressed forward, but deep down, unease began to coil in her chest. She glanced at the signal bars on her phone. Nothing, not even a flicker of connection. The realization made the storm feel heavier, as if it were isolating her on purpose. Another mile passed before the first real sign of trouble appeared. The dashboard lights flickered. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the product of nerves wound too tight. But when it happened again, and the hum of the engine faltered for a fraction of a second, she knew something was wrong. Her heart beat faster. She tried to push the car forward, but the sputtering grew worse. With a resigned breath, Olivia steered toward the narrow shoulder, the tires sloshing through deep puddles until they came to a stop. The engine gave one last shudder before dying entirely, leaving her with nothing but the muffled drumming of rain on metal. For a moment, she just sat there, staring ahead as the fog from her breath curled upward inside the chilled air of the cabin. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and considered her options. The road was empty in both directions, the only movement coming from the sheets of rain that blurred the world beyond the glass. She could wait, but for how long? In this weather, it was unlikely anyone would pass by quickly, and even if they did, would they notice her through this curtain of water? The cold began to seep through the car's interior. She tapped the phone again, hoping for a miracle, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. No signal, no help. The isolation pressed against her ribs like a weight. She was a Harper, used to control, to immediate solutions, to resources appearing at a snap of her fingers. But here, in the middle of nowhere, all the influence and wealth in her name meant nothing. A crack of thunder exploded overhead, rattling the air so violently that she flinched. The sudden fear tipped her decision. She could not just sit and wait. Somewhere nearby there had to be shelter. A farmhouse, a small store, anything that would keep the storm at bay until morning. Pulling the hood of her coat over her head, Olivia stepped out into the deluge. The rain hit her like cold needles, soaking through the fabric in seconds. The wind shoved at her with icy hands, and her shoes sank into the muddy edge of the road. She closed the car door against the storm and began walking, head down, her breath coming fast as water trickled down her face. Every step felt heavier than the last. The world around her was a blur of grey and black, shapes shifting and vanishing as she tried to make out the faint outlines of buildings or lights. Her hair clung to her skin, and the chill crept deeper, wrapping around her bones. Still, she pushed forward, because stopping meant being left alone with the storm, and that was a thought she could not bear. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she saw a faint glow, or perhaps it was only lightning. Either way, she fixed her gaze in that direction, willing her legs to keep moving through the endless sheets of rain, not knowing that this night would lead her to a stranger who would change her life forever. The storm was not easing. If anything, it had grown more vengeful. The rain seemed to fall in sheets so thick that they could have been solid, and the wind screamed across the open fields with the force of something ancient and angry. Olivia pressed on, her steps squelching through mud and puddles, her coat clinging to her like a wet shroud. Her breath came in short bursts, each inhalation filling her lungs with air that was icy enough to sting. She had no clear idea where she was going. The road ahead was a winding ribbon, Its edges blurred into the waterlogged ground, and the few trees standing sent their branches whipping wildly under the pressure of the gale. After several long minutes that felt like hours, she saw it, the dim outline of a house at the end of a gravel driveway. The lights inside glowed faintly through the downpour, and for a moment, hope flared within her. The thought of warmth, of shelter, of simply not being alone against this tempest pushed her forward. Her feet slipped in the slick mud as she turned off the road and trudged up the drive, the gravel barely visible beneath the flood of water rushing downhill. She reached the small porch, its overhang offering the barest reprieve from the deluge, and pounded on the door. Her knuckles stung from the impact, and she waited, shivering, straining to hear any sound from within over the roar of rain. For a long moment, nothing. Then faintly, footsteps approached. Relief rushed through her, until the light behind the frosted glass dimmed and the sound receded. Whoever had come to the door had turned away. Confusion and disbelief mingled with frustration. She knocked again, louder this time, calling out, her voice hoarse and shaking. "Please, I need help. My car broke down." The words were nearly swallowed by the storm, but surely they could be heard on the other side. Still, no response came. The silence was more cutting than any spoken refusal. A fresh gust of wind sliced through the porch, spraying her with cold rain and forcing her to take a step back. She pulled her hood tighter, teeth chattering, and turned reluctantly away from the house. If they would not open the door, there was nothing more she could do. She had to keep moving before the cold fully rooted itself into her limbs. Back on the road, the storm closed around her once more. Each gust shoved her sideways, threatening to topple her into the ditches that lined the narrow path. The darkness pressed in, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning that revealed the world in stark white-blue images. The skeletal trees, the endless water, the sharp glint of raindrops caught mid-fall. Another house emerged from the gloom, larger than the first, with its shutters clattering wildly in the wind. Olivia staggered toward it, climbing a short set of steps that was slick with rain. She knocked, at first tentatively, then with urgency. The lights inside flickered briefly, as though someone had moved through a hallway, and she felt a flicker of hope again. She knocked a third time, her voice breaking as she called out for help. This time, a shadow appeared in the window beside the door. It lingered for several seconds, unmoving, and then retreated. A moment later, the lights in the house went dark altogether, leaving her staring at her own dim reflection in the glass. The rejection was absolute. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and disbelief. It was as though the storm had not only trapped her physically, but had also driven away any shred of human compassion in the area. The thought chilled her more than the wind. She stepped down from the porch, boots splashing into a deep puddle, and kept walking. Her clothes were now soaked through entirely. Water dripped from her hair into her eyes, blurring her vision. The cold had burrowed so deeply into her fingers that she could barely feel them when she curled them into fists. The road seemed endless, the storm unyielding. With every house she passed, she knocked. Sometimes there was no answer at all, sometimes the faintest sound of movement, but never an open door. The refusals blurred together into a single feeling, isolation sharpened by desperation. She could not understand it. In her world, the world of polished hotel lobbies, eager staff, and constant service, help was immediate, almost instinctive. Out here, in the dark and the rain, she was discovering a colder truth. Her steps slowed as exhaustion began to set in. Her legs felt heavy, her shoulders hunched against the wind's unending push. She could not tell how far she had gone or how long she had been walking. All she knew was that the storm showed no signs of ending, and she was running out of strength. But somewhere inside her, a stubborn thread held on. She would find shelter. She had to. Giving in to the storm was not an option, no matter how hostile the night seemed. And so she kept moving, each step an act of sheer will, scanning the shifting shadows ahead for any sign of light that might lead her to safety. It was then, just as she was nearing the point of collapse, that a faint golden glow appeared in the distance, a single, steady light burning through the dark. It was small, almost fragile, but it was there. She focused on it, each step pulling her closer, her mind fixed on the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this door would open. The glow ahead was faint, but to Olivia, it felt like a beacon. The storm had worn her down to the point where her muscles burned with every movement, Her wet clothes weighed her down, and her vision blurred from rain and fatigue. She kept her eyes fixed on that fragile circle of light, afraid that if she looked away, it would vanish like a mirage. Each step seemed to take an eternity, her boots sinking into the waterlogged ground, as if the earth itself wanted to hold her back. The closer she drew, the more the shape of the house emerged through the sheets of rain. It was small, with weathered wooden siding that looked grey in the storm's dim light. A single window glowed from within, the curtains half drawn but loose enough to let the warm yellow light spill into the night. Unlike the other homes she had approached, this one had no looming silence about it. The glow was steady, almost inviting, and even though she told herself not to hope, she felt her pace quicken despite her exhaustion. The path to the front door was a narrow stretch of uneven boards, likely laid to keep feet out of the mud. They were slick under her shoes, forcing her to hold her arms out slightly to keep her balance. She reached the small porch, which was barely more than a few planks covered by a shallow overhang, and stood before the door, trying to gather enough breath to speak. She knocked, not with the frantic desperation she had used earlier in the night, but with a firm, steady rhythm. She didn't expect much. The last several houses had taught her that hope could be cruel. Yet within seconds she heard footsteps, soft ones, light enough to suggest someone moving quickly but cautiously. The door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. The woman who stood there was unlike anyone Olivia had seen so far that night. She was middle-aged with lines of fatigue etched gently around her eyes, but there was nothing cold in her gaze. Her brown hair was tied back loosely, a few strands falling across her forehead. She wore a plain dress covered by a faded apron, as though she had been in the middle of some quiet domestic task when Olivia arrived. The woman's eyes widened as she took in Olivia's soaked hair, shivering frame, and mud-streaked clothes. "My goodness," the woman said, her voice carrying both concern and surprise. "Come in, quickly. You'll freeze out there." Olivia hesitated for a second, stunned by the offer. She stepped forward, the door swinging wider to admit her. The moment she crossed the threshold, the difference was immediate. The air inside was warmer, scented faintly with something savory and comforting, perhaps soup simmering on a stove. The storm's roar dulled to a muted background hum. The woman shut the door firmly against the wind and turned to face her guest. "I'm Mary Collins," she said simply. "Let's get you out of those wet things before you catch your death." Her tone left no room for argument. Not that Olivia had the strength to protest. Mary moved quickly, fetching an armful of towels from a nearby cupboard. They were old and frayed at the edges, but they were blessedly dry and soft against Olivia's chilled skin. As she wrapped one around her shoulders, the shivering began to subside, replaced by a slow, spreading warmth. "You're lucky you found my house," Mary continued, as she guided Olivia toward a modest living room. "Not many people keep lights on during a storm like this. Power tends to go out around here." She gestured toward a small sofa near the hearth, where the faint glow of embers promised more warmth. "Sit there. I'll get you something hot to drink." Olivia sank onto the couch, her body grateful for the support. The room was humble but clean, decorated with mismatched furniture that looked well-loved rather than worn out. A few framed photographs lined a shelf, though the low light made it difficult to see them clearly. Everything in the space spoke of practicality and care. Nothing lavish, but nothing neglected either. As Mary moved into the kitchen, the clink of dishes and the gentle hiss of the stove reached Olivia's ears. She felt a strange sensation, not just relief, but an almost childlike comfort in the idea that someone was taking care of her, expecting nothing in return. She was used to interactions built on transactions, where generosity came with strings attached. This, however, felt different. Mary returned with a steaming mug. "It's chamomile tea," she explained, placing it gently into Olivia's hands. "It'll help warm you up from the inside." Olivia accepted it gratefully, the heat radiating through the ceramic into her fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice low as though speaking too loudly might break the fragile calm that had settled between them. Mary gave a small smile. "Storm like this, you don't leave anyone out in it. Now, drink that, while I see if I can find you something dry to wear." For the first time that night, Olivia let her guard down. She sipped the tea slowly, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. The sound of the storm outside no longer felt like a threat, but like something distant and contained. She knew nothing about Mary Collins beyond her name, and the kindness she had shown. Yet in that moment, it was enough. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Olivia suspected she would remember this night for a long time. Not because of the storm, but because this small, humble house had opened its door when every other had stayed locked. The air inside Mary's house felt like a world apart from the chaos raging outside. The storm's howl was still faintly audible through the walls, but here it was, softened, reduced to a distant murmur that seemed incapable of reaching Olivia in full force. She sat on the edge of the sofa, cradling the mug of chamomile tea between her hands, inhaling the gentle floral scent. The heat radiated through the ceramic, coaxing the stiffness from her fingers little by little. Her clothes, however, were still clinging to her like a second skin, cold and heavy. She felt as though the dampness had seeped into her very bones. Mary returned from a narrow hallway with a small bundle of clothing folded neatly in her arms. "They're not fancy," she said, almost apologetically, "but they're dry and warm." She set them on the armrest of the sofa, a thick flannel shirt, a pair of soft sweatpants, and woolen socks that had clearly been mended at least once. Olivia ran her fingers over the fabric. It was worn but clean, carrying the faint scent of laundry soap. "I can't thank you enough," Olivia began, her voice still faint from exhaustion, but Mary waved a hand dismissively. "Go change in the bathroom, down the hall on the left. Leave your wet things by the door and I'll hang them up by the stove to dry a bit." The thought of stepping out of her soaked clothing was irresistible. Olivia rose, still clutching the towel around her shoulders, and followed Mary's instructions. The bathroom was small, with a curtain drawn over the single window and a shelf of neatly stacked toiletries above the sink. She changed quickly, the warmth of the flannel and the softness of the socks enveloping her like a gentle embrace. For a brief moment, she simply stood there, letting her body adjust to the sudden comfort, before gathering her wet clothes and returning to the living room. Mary was already tending to the stove, adding a small log to the embers and adjusting the iron kettle that sat on top. She took the damp bundle from Olivia and draped each piece carefully over a wooden rack nearby. "They won't be bone dry tonight," she explained, "but at least they won't be icy when you put them back on in the morning." Olivia sat again, this time sinking deeper into the worn cushions. The couch was lumpy in places, the fabric threadbare, but there was something grounding about it. She wrapped the towel more securely around herself and took another sip of tea, feeling the warmth spread steadily through her chest. "You live here alone?" she asked, glancing around the room. Mary shook her head. "No, my son is asleep in the bedroom. He's 6. I work 2 jobs to keep us afloat, so by the time I get home, I want to make sure he's warm and fed before anything else." The way Mary said it was so matter-of-fact, without bitterness, that Olivia found herself unexpectedly moved. She had grown up in a world where needs were met instantly and without question, where comfort was an unshakable constant. Mary's quiet acceptance of her own reality was something entirely different and strangely admirable. The kettle began to whistle softly, and Mary poured hot water into a small pot. "I've got some vegetable soup left from dinner," she said. "It's simple, but it will help you warm up faster." Soon the smell of simmering broth filled the air, carrying the earthy notes of carrots, potatoes, and herbs. Mary ladled a generous portion into a deep ceramic bowl and set it in front of Olivia on the low table. The soup's surface steamed in the lamplight, and Olivia could feel the heat even before she picked up the spoon. The first sip was almost overwhelming in its simplicity. Hearty vegetables, tender from long cooking, suspended in a broth that tasted as though it had been seasoned with patience rather than extravagance. It was the kind of meal she had rarely encountered, one that seemed less concerned with impressing and more with sustaining. Mary sat in a nearby chair, sipping her own tea, not pressing for conversation, but simply allowing Olivia the space to recover. Outside, the rain continued to lash against the windows, but it no longer felt like an enemy at the door. The small living room had become a haven, the storm's reach unable to breach its quiet boundaries. Olivia felt an odd awareness settling over her, a recognition that she was receiving something rare, something money could never truly buy. The warmth of the tea, the solid weight of the wool socks on her feet, the smell of the soup and the quiet presence of a stranger who had opened her home without hesitation formed a cocoon of safety she hadn't known she needed until this moment. She glanced toward Mary, who was now mending a tear in a dish towel with small, careful stitches. It was such a humble image, yet it carried a quiet dignity. Olivia wondered how many nights like this Mary had weathered, tending to her child, managing her home, facing storms both literal and figurative, without anyone noticing, without anyone offering her the kind of care she so freely gave to a stranger tonight. When the bowl was empty, Olivia felt not just physically nourished but steadier somehow, as though a frayed thread inside her had been rewoven. She leaned back, closing her eyes briefly, listening to the stove's gentle crackle and the soft tap of rain on the roof. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe she might make it to morning without fear. Mary rose quietly and fetched a folded quilt from a nearby chair. "You can sleep here on the sofa," she said. "It's not the softest bed, but it's warm. I'll turn the lamp down so you can rest." Olivia accepted the quilt, its weight settling over her like a promise. She realized then that she did not even know why Mary had helped her, when so many others had turned her away. Perhaps she thought it did not matter. The gesture itself was enough, and in this moment, it was everything. The hours stretched quietly as the storm maintained its relentless assault on the world outside. Every now and then, a gust of wind would rattle the loose edges of the window frame or send the rain slanting sharply against the glass. But inside, the small living room held onto its warmth. Olivia had pulled the quilt more snugly around herself, her legs tucked under her, the mug of tea now resting empty on the low table beside the drained bowl of soup. Mary had taken a seat across from her, still working on mending the dish towel, the steady motion of her needle moving through the fabric, a soft, almost rhythmic sound. It was the kind of simple domestic act that seemed to anchor the space in calm. After a long stretch of silence that was not uncomfortable but heavy with the weight of unspoken things, Mary glanced up. "You were out there long," she said, her tone more an observation than a question. Olivia nodded. "I was driving back from a meeting in the city. Thought I'd take the quieter route. My car broke down I don't even know how far back now. I tried a few houses, but..." She trailed off, not quite wanting to admit how many doors had stayed shut. Mary's eyes softened, as though she already knew the end of that sentence. "People get nervous out here during storms. Some think opening the door at night is asking for trouble. I suppose I can't judge them for it, but..." She paused, then shrugged. "Sometimes you've just got to trust your instincts. You didn't look like trouble to me." There was no accusation in her words, no pity either, just a statement of fact, the kind that left little room for defense because none was needed. Olivia found herself smiling faintly, though she was not entirely sure why. "You live far from here?" Mary asked after a moment, setting the dish towel aside. "Not far by car, but tonight it might as well have been another planet," Olivia replied. She hesitated before adding, "I live in Boston, actually. This trip was just business." Mary nodded slowly, as if filing the information away without judgment. "Boston," she repeated. "That's a whole different world from here. I've never been." Olivia studied her for a moment. There was no envy in the way Mary said it, no longing that might have hinted at regret, just acknowledgement. "It is different," Olivia admitted. "Louder, faster. People rarely stop to talk, even when the weather's perfect. Sometimes it feels like no one even sees each other unless they have to." Mary leaned back in her chair, considering that. That's not so different from here, if you think about it. People can live side by side for years and still not really know one another. I suppose kindness doesn't depend on geography. The simplicity of the statement struck Olivia harder than she expected. She was used to drawing sharp lines between the polished world she inhabited and the rural landscapes she only glimpsed from a car window. Hearing Mary flatten those differences with one quiet observation unsettled something in her. As the conversation unfolded, Mary began to share pieces of her life without embellishment. She spoke of her son, Jacob, who was asleep in the small back bedroom, his school just a mile away. She explained how she worked mornings at the local diner and evenings cleaning offices in town, juggling schedules to make sure she could always tuck Jacob into bed. "I'm not saying it's easy," Mary said, her voice low but steady. "But you do what you have to. He's a good boy, deserves better than I had growing up." Olivia listened, drawn in by the quiet resilience beneath Mary's words. It was a different kind of strength than the corporate ambition she knew so well, not about climbing ladders or securing deals, but about showing up every single day, no matter how tired, because someone depended on you. When Olivia spoke about her own life, she found herself more reserved, not out of secrecy but out of a strange self-consciousness. Telling Mary about board meetings, luxury hotels and private drivers felt oddly out of place here, as though each detail might only emphasize the gulf between their worlds. Still, she offered fragments: her work in the family's hotel chain, the constant travel, the way her schedule often left little room for anything personal. Mary didn't comment on the differences. She only nodded now and then, her attention as steady as her gaze. "Work is work," she said at one point. "Doesn't matter if you're scrubbing floors or signing contracts. It can take everything out of you if you let it." Olivia was surprised to realize she agreed. The wind outside surged again, sending a sharp rattle through the glass. Mary rose and checked the latch on the nearest window, then returned to her seat. "It's going to be like this all night," she said. "Best to just wait it out. I've got extra blankets if you get cold." For a while after that, the two women sat without speaking, the storm filling the silence between them. Olivia felt a peculiar sense of connection, not the kind forged in shared experiences or common goals, but something quieter, built on the simple fact that one had opened a door when the other had needed it most. When she finally stretched out on the sofa, pulling the quilt to her chin, she noticed Mary still seated across the room, sipping tea and gazing into the middle distance. It occurred to Olivia that maybe Mary was used to nights like this. Long, slow hours punctuated by the sound of rain, a lone light burning against the dark. For the first time since her car had failed, Olivia felt certain she was safe. The knowledge settled over her like the weight of the quilt, warm and steady as the storm carried on outside. The hours that followed seemed suspended, as though the storm outside had slowed time itself. Olivia lay curled on the sofa beneath the quilt Mary had given her, her body sinking into the lumpy cushions with a heaviness that was more than physical. Fatigue clung to her like the damp air she had carried in with her earlier, but it was softened now by the warmth of the room and the quiet hum of domestic life around her. The fire in the stove had burned down to a low bed of glowing embers, casting a faint orange shimmer over the worn furniture. Mary had gone into the back bedroom to check on her son, her footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. When she returned, she carried another blanket over her arm and draped it gently over Olivia without a word. The gesture stirred something in Olivia, a sense of being cared for in a way she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the calculated courtesy of hotel staff or the obligatory politeness of business associates. This was something simpler, stripped of pretense, offered without any expectation of return. She tried to remember the last time someone had done something for her, without it being part of an arrangement, a favor, or an exchange of influence. The thought was disquieting. Her life had been built around transactions. Even kindness in her world often came with hidden terms. Tonight, in this modest home, she was experiencing a different currency altogether. As she shifted beneath the blankets, the scent of the quilt reached her. Faint traces of laundry soap, mixed with something warm and familiar she couldn't quite name. Perhaps the lingering aroma of dinners past, or simply the scent of a home lived in with care. It was comforting in a way that caught her off guard. Mary settled into her chair again, her hands busy with some quiet task Olivia couldn't quite see from her angle. For a while, the only sounds were the occasional snap from the stove and the muffled rumble of thunder. The rhythm of it all began to ease Olivia's mind, the tension in her shoulders melting into the fabric beneath her. The sofa was nothing like the plush beds she was used to. The cushions sagged, and one spring pressed faintly against her side. Yet she felt a strange sense of belonging here. The room's imperfections didn't diminish its comfort. They seemed instead to be part of what made it feel alive. There was no sterile perfection, no carefully curated decor. Everything had a purpose, a history, and a quiet pride in its continued use. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Rain still battered the roof in steady waves, but it no longer sounded threatening. It had become a kind of lullaby, blending with the warmth in the room, until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Her mind drifted briefly to the homes she had approached earlier, the locked doors, the darkened windows, the silhouettes that had vanished rather than opened to her. She could still feel the sting of those moments, the way they had deepened the cold already inside her. Yet here she was now, in a place that by all appearances had less to spare than any of those houses, and she had been welcomed without hesitation. Mary looked up from her task and caught Olivia watching her. "You should try to get some rest," she said gently. "The storm's not going anywhere for a while." Olivia nodded, pulling the blankets closer around her. "I'll try. Thank you for all of this." Mary's smile was small but genuine. Anyone would have done the same. Olivia wasn't sure that was true, and she suspected Mary knew it too. Still, she didn't press the point. When sleep finally came, it was deep and unbroken. The wind continued to lash the house, and the rain pounded the roof, but none of it reached her dreams. She slept without the restless turning that often marked her nights in luxury hotel rooms, where the sheets were immaculate, but the space felt impersonal. Here, the uneven couch and patched quilt offered a sense of grounding that no high thread count linen could match. Sometime in the early hours, she stirred briefly. The glow from the stove had dimmed further, leaving the room in soft shadow. She could just make out Mary's figure still in the chair, her head tilted back as she dozed lightly, as though keeping watch. The sight settled something in Olivia's chest, an unspoken assurance that she was not alone. When she closed her eyes again, the thought lingered. The night was still hard in many ways. Her car was broken down miles from help, the storm was unyielding, and the morning held uncertainties she couldn't yet name. But here, in this small pocket of warmth, there was care, and for now, that was enough. By the time the first pale suggestion of dawn began to press faintly against the edges of the curtains, Olivia was still asleep, her breathing even, her body wrapped in warmth that came not from the blankets alone, but from the quiet, steady kindness of the woman who had let her in. Outside, the storm still raged, but inside her heart had found a rare peace. The first thing Olivia noticed when she stirred was the absence of the storm's roar. The relentless drumming of rain that had filled the night was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar stillness. For a moment she lay with her eyes closed, savoring the sensation of waking in warmth, the quilt heavy over her, the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. A sliver of light pressed against her eyelids, and when she finally opened them, she found the room bathed in a pale gold glow. The curtains were drawn just enough for morning sunlight to slip through, casting long, gentle shapes across the floor. The furniture, the mended towels, the small stove, all of it seemed softer in the daylight, less a fortress against the elements, and more simply a home. The air still held a chill, but it was nothing like the biting cold she had endured on the roadside the night before. Mary's voice came from the kitchen, carrying easily through the modest house. "There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some." Olivia sat up slowly, pulling the quilt from her shoulders but keeping it draped over her lap. Her muscles ached from the tension of the night before, but there was a looseness to her movements now, the kind that comes after a night of deep, untroubled rest. She placed her bare feet on the worn rug and padded toward the kitchen, following the smell of fresh coffee and something faintly sweet. Mary stood at the small counter, placing slices of bread into a skillet. She turned as Olivia entered, her expression one of quiet welcome. "You slept well, I hope." "I did," Olivia replied honestly. "Better than I've slept in a long time, actually." Mary smiled at that and poured coffee into a ceramic mug before handing it over. "It's not fancy, but it's hot. Helps take the morning chill out of the air." Olivia took a sip, the bitter warmth settling quickly in her chest. She glanced toward the window above the sink and saw the world outside transformed. The sky, washed clean of storm clouds, stretched wide and impossibly blue. The trees stood dripping but still, their branches no longer whipped by wind. Puddles sparkled where the sunlight struck them, and the gravel road, though slick, looked navigable again. "It's hard to believe it's the same place as last night," Olivia murmured. "That's how it is around here," Mary said, flipping the bread with an easy motion. "One minute you think the world's coming apart, and the next, it's like nothing happened. But the mess is still there to clean up." She nodded toward the small yard outside, where branches and leaves lay scattered like fallen confetti. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table, toasted bread with butter, a few slices of apple, and more coffee. It was a simple meal, but Olivia found herself savoring it, not just for the food but for the company. She watched as Mary moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, every action deliberate yet unhurried. It was a rhythm Olivia recognized from her own life, but there it had been driven by deadlines and schedules. Here it seemed guided by care. When the meal was done, Mary fetched a small toolbox from a closet and placed it by the door. "There's a mechanic in town who owes me a favor," she said. "I'll give him a call and see if he can come take a look at your car." Olivia's instinct was to reach for her phone, but when she did, she found that the screen still showed no service. She frowned. Still no signal. Mary nodded. "It's spotty after a storm. Lines go down. But Harold, that's the mechanic, has a radio, so I can get a message to him." True to her word, Mary stepped outside and walked to a neighboring property, returning about 15 minutes later with the news that Harold was on his way. "He said to meet him by your car. You'll need to drive him back into town once he gets it running." Olivia pulled on her now dry clothes, the flannel shirt and wool socks replaced by her own jeans and sweater, which Mary had warmed near the stove. The thought of stepping back into the day felt strange after the cocoon of safety she had found here. They walked together down the road toward the spot where Olivia's car had sat abandoned the night before. The landscape looked almost unrecognizable in the morning light. Fields stretched out in neat rows beyond the road, their edges marked by fences now glistening with water. The air was fresh, carrying the earthy scent of wet soil and the faint perfume of grass and leaves. When they reached the car, Harold was already there, a sturdy man with weathered hands and a genial nod. He bent over the engine without fuss, muttering occasionally to himself as he worked. Within minutes, he found the problem: a flooded engine and a loose connection that had likely shaken free in the wind. "Shouldn't be too hard to fix," he said, glancing at Olivia. "You'll be on your way in no time." While Harold worked, Olivia turned to Mary. "I don't know how to thank you enough," she said quietly. Mary shrugged in that understated way of hers. "You don't have to. You needed help, and I could give it. That's all." When the car finally rumbled back to life, the sound felt like a bridge between two worlds, the hardship of the night before and the return to her usual life. Olivia gripped the steering wheel, then looked back at the woman standing by the roadside. "I'll be in touch," she promised. "I mean it." Mary smiled, her expression touched with something Olivia couldn't quite name. "Drive safe." As Olivia pulled away, the sun caught the small figure in the rearview mirror, standing in front of the weathered wooden house. The storm had passed, but the memory of its darkest hours and the door that had finally opened stayed with her as the road unwound ahead. The familiar skyline of Boston appeared in the distance like a promise and a demand all at once. Olivia guided her car along the smooth highway, the engine humming steadily now, a stark contrast to the spluttering silence of the previous night. The city's towers rose into a pale afternoon sky, their glass and steel surfaces catching the sun in sharp reflections. Each mile brought her closer to the life she had built, one of constant movement, precise schedules, and carefully measured success. When she finally turned into the private drive leading to her family's estate, the shift from the rural simplicity she had left behind was immediate. The gates opened smoothly on their automated tracks, and the manicured gardens stretched out in symmetrical perfection on either side. The mansion's facade gleamed with fresh paint, the windows spotless, the hedges trimmed into shapes that spoke of meticulous care. The house stood exactly as she had left it, untouched by storms or the uncertainty of the night before. Inside, the polished floors reflected the afternoon light, and the faint scent of fresh flowers filled the air. Lilies today, arranged by the household staff who changed the displays weekly. Olivia's heels clicked softly as she crossed the marble entryway. Her assistant Marcus appeared almost instantly, tablet in hand, ready to brief her on the day's pressing matters. "2 calls from the New York office," he began, "and a request from the Paris property regarding the winter renovation budget. Your father also wants to confirm your attendance at the board dinner on Thursday." Olivia listened, nodding occasionally, but her thoughts kept drifting. Marcus's voice, precise and efficient, became a kind of background hum as her mind returned to the quiet living room in Mary's house, the mended towels, the patched quilt, the steam rising from a bowl of soup. By the time she reached her office, a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the garden, she felt a restlessness she couldn't quite name. The desk, perfectly organized, waited for her attention, but instead she stood at the window, watching the way the light caught on the glass of the greenhouse beyond. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm. Calls were returned, budgets reviewed, decisions made. She moved from one task to the next with practiced efficiency, yet something in her pace had shifted. Normally, she would immerse herself completely in the work, the hours passing in a blur of numbers and negotiations. Now her mind wandered, uninvited, to the memory of rain on the roof, of Mary's calm voice, of a wooden house that had stood as a beacon when every other light had been shuttered. That night, she dined with her parents in the formal dining room. The long table was set with silver and crystal, the meal prepared by the chef who knew each family member's preferences. Conversations circled around business expansions, philanthropic galas, and travel plans for the upcoming quarter. Olivia participated, contributing where expected, but found herself speaking less than usual. Her father noticed, giving her a sharp look at one point. "Everything all right?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Yes, just tired. The drive back took longer than I thought." They accepted the explanation, and the conversation moved on, but she felt the weight of the small untruth. Tiredness wasn't the problem. If anything, she felt more awake than she had in months, awake in a way that made her aware of the space between the life she lived and the one she had glimpsed in a single stormy night. Later, in her private sitting room, she sank into the armchair by the fireplace, a glass of wine untouched on the side table. Outside, the gardens lay in orderly rows under the glow of carefully placed lanterns. She imagined instead the untamed fields that had surrounded Mary's home, the gravel road winding through a landscape shaped by weather and work rather than by design. She thought about the doors that had stayed closed, the way she had been left to face the storm alone until she reached the one house that had opened without hesitation. In her world, generosity was often a matter of public image, measured in press coverage and tax benefits. But Mary's kindness had been quiet, unseen by anyone but the two of them, and it had cost her something: time, resources, a portion of her evening that she could have spent resting or tending to her own needs. Olivia found herself wondering about Mary and her son. Were they having dinner together now? Was the little boy talking about his day at school? Was Mary clearing the table and mending something by the stove as she had the night before? The thought lingered as she prepared for bed. In the mirror, her reflection looked the same as always, polished, composed, the image of someone in control. But behind her eyes, something had shifted, a restlessness that would not be smoothed away by routine or luxury. When she lay down in her silk-covered bed, the softness felt almost foreign. She closed her eyes and heard the memory of rain, the quiet scrape of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, and the voice that had said, "Storm like this, you don't leave anyone out in it." It was well past midnight when she finally fell asleep, the city silent outside her windows, her mind already turning toward a decision she didn't yet know she was making. The following days unfolded with the same precision that defined Olivia's life. Meetings filled her mornings, travel itineraries shaped her afternoons, and formal dinners claimed her evenings. On the surface, everything ran smoothly, but underneath, a persistent thought threaded itself through her every action. Mary Collins. The memory of that night had not faded. Instead, it had sharpened with each passing day, the details etched more clearly into her mind. She could still feel the damp chill clinging to her skin before stepping into Mary's house, could still smell the faint mix of soup and wood smoke, could still hear the calm steadiness in Mary's voice. It was not simply gratitude that kept the memory alive. It was a realization that she had encountered a kind of generosity that existed far outside the calculated exchanges she knew so well. On the sixth morning after her return, Olivia sat in her office staring at the open laptop in front of her. A proposal for the expansion of the Chicago property waited for her review, but her focus was elsewhere. Her hand rested on a notepad where she had, without realizing it, written and rewritten the same phrase. "You didn't look like trouble to me." Her assistant entered with the day's agenda, but before he could begin, Olivia spoke. "Marcus, I need you to clear my afternoon." He hesitated, clearly surprised. "Do you have something specific in mind?" "Yes," she replied. "I'm taking a trip." The logistics moved quickly. A car from her private garage was readied, the one she preferred for long drives. Sleek, black, and polished to a mirror shine. Two of her legal advisors and a trusted estate manager were instructed to accompany her, though none of them knew exactly why. Olivia gave only the destination, the small rural area she had passed through before the storm. The drive out of Boston was smooth, the city receding into suburbs, then into open stretches of road flanked by trees just beginning to shift toward autumn colors. As the miles passed, Olivia felt an unusual tension, not the kind that came before negotiations or public appearances, but a quieter anticipation, the sense of approaching something significant, yet uncertain. By mid-afternoon, they turned onto the same winding rural road she had traveled that night. It looked entirely different in daylight and under clear skies. The fields were golden and green, the air carrying the scent of dry grass and distant wood smoke. The gravel drive leading to Mary's house appeared ahead, unchanged except for a scattering of leaves that hinted at the coming season. The car came to a stop, and Olivia stepped out, her heels crunching lightly on the gravel. The house was as modest as she remembered. Weathered siding, a porch that sagged just slightly, a single curtain fluttering in the open window. Her advisors hung back, uncertain, as she walked to the door and knocked. It opened after only a moment, and there was Mary, her expression shifting from curiosity to mild astonishment. "Olivia?" she asked, as though unsure she was seeing correctly. "Hello, Mary," Olivia said, her tone warm but purposeful. "I told you I'd be in touch." Mary stepped aside to let her in, glancing at the car parked in the driveway and the group of well-dressed individuals standing near it. "This is unexpected," she admitted. Inside, the house looked much the same as before, neat, humble, carrying the same faint scent of wood and fabric. Olivia took a moment to look around, her eyes tracing the small details she remembered, the mended towels folded on a chair, the framed photographs on the shelf, the worn rug near the stove. "I wanted to thank you properly," Olivia began, meeting Mary's gaze. "That night you didn't know me. You had no reason to open your door, but you did. You shared what you had, even though it wasn't much. I've been thinking about that ever since." Mary gave a small shrug as though the act had required no thought. It was the right thing to do, that's all. "Maybe," Olivia said, "but it meant a great deal to me. And I believe in repaying kindness, not just equally, but fully." Mary's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." Olivia gestured toward the doorway where her advisors waited. "I came here today to make some changes, for you and for Jacob. I'd like to renovate this house completely. New roof, new plumbing, new everything. And I want to set up a trust fund to cover your son's education all the way through university." For a moment, Mary said nothing, her expression caught between disbelief and caution. "That's more than I can accept," she said slowly. "You don't owe me anything, Olivia. I didn't help you to get something back." "I know," Olivia replied, her voice steady. "But you did help me. And not just by giving me shelter. You reminded me that generosity doesn't have to be calculated. I want to honor that. Please let me." The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Mary looked toward the bedroom door, as though thinking of her son, then back at Olivia. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Olivia suggested gently. Outside, the afternoon light shifted, spilling gold through the small window and touching the edges of the modest room. The decision hung in the air between them, weighted with the knowledge that a single word could change the course of both their lives. Mary's lips parted slightly, but the answer had not yet formed. In that moment, Olivia felt the rare certainty that whatever came next, she would see it through. Mary stood in her modest living room, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair she had been about to sit in when Olivia arrived. The weight of what she had just heard seemed to press into her shoulders, yet she remained rooted in place. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet apprehension. Olivia, still standing near the doorway, watched her with patient resolve, aware that she had just proposed a change far beyond anything Mary might have expected when she opened her door that afternoon. "I don't think you realize what you're offering," Mary finally said, her voice low but steady. "This house, it's been in my family for 3 generations. My parents lived here, their parents before them. It's old, yes, and it's not perfect, but it's ours. I've worked hard to keep it standing, even when things got tight. Renovating it completely, that's no small thing." "I know it's not," Olivia replied, her tone calm, each word deliberate. "And I wouldn't suggest it lightly. I've brought people with me who can handle every step. Permits, design, construction. It will still be your home, Mary, but safer, warmer, and free from the repairs that keep piling up." She gestured toward the corner of the ceiling, where a faint water stain had spread from years of rain seeping through the roof. "I noticed this when I was here before. You shouldn't have to worry about that every winter." Mary glanced at the stain, then back at Olivia, the smallest trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "You notice a lot for someone who was here only one night." Olivia allowed herself a faint smile in return. "When you're forced to stop moving for once, you see more than you expect." The advisors Olivia had brought waited quietly outside, aware that this was a conversation not to be rushed. Through the open door, the low hum of their muted voices drifted in along with the crisp scent of autumn leaves. Mary shifted slightly, one hand moving to rest on the curve of the chair back, her fingers tapping in an absent rhythm. "And this fund for Jacob," she said carefully. "What exactly are you talking about?" Olivia took a slow breath. "A trust in his name large enough to cover his education through university, tuition, books, housing, enough so that he can choose his path without worrying about whether you can afford it. You'd still have complete say over how it's managed while he's a minor, but the security would be there for him." Mary's brows drew together, the weight of the offer clearly sinking in. It's more than anyone's ever done for me, more than I could have imagined." Olivia stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I'm doing it because you showed me something that night. You gave me warmth, food, and a place to rest without knowing who I was. You didn't ask for credentials, you didn't ask for anything in return, you just opened your door." Mary exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries both hesitation and the beginnings of acceptance. She looked toward the small hallway where her son's room was. "You know, he still talks about the storm lady who slept on our couch. He thought it was the most exciting thing that ever happened here." Olivia's lips curved into a genuine smile at the thought. "I'd like him to remember that night for something more than the storm. I'd like him to remember it as the night his future began to change." Outside, the sunlight shifted as the afternoon deepened, filtering through the branches of the trees and scattering faint shadows across the worn floorboards. Olivia could sense that Mary was turning the offer over in her mind, weighing not just the practical benefits but the deeper implications. Finally, Mary spoke, her voice quiet. "If I say yes, you promise me something." "Anything," Olivia said without hesitation. "You promise me you're not doing this for show. No newspaper articles, no cameras, no speeches. I don't want to be some story about the rich woman who helped the poor single mother. I don't want that for Jacob either." Olivia's expression softened. "I promise. This stays between us, and the people who need to know to make it happen. No headlines, no publicity, just the work getting done." Mary studied her face for a long moment, as though searching for any trace of insincerity. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "All right. If you're certain, then yes." The word seemed to carry a quiet finality, a shift in the air between them. Olivia extended her hand, and Mary shook it, the handshake firm and unpretentious. From outside, one of Olivia's advisors took a step forward, sensing that permission had been granted. Olivia turned toward the door and called them in, introducing Mary to each by name. They spoke in practical terms now, timelines, budgets, the possibility of Mary and Jacob staying elsewhere during construction if necessary. Mary listened, her posture straight, her responses thoughtful. Olivia watched her throughout, struck again by the quiet strength that had been so evident the night she found shelter here. It was not a strength that announced itself with grand gestures or loud declarations, but one that endured through storms, through years of hard work, through the quiet sacrifices that so often went unnoticed. As the discussion wound down, Olivia stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the crisp air. The sky was streaked with late afternoon light, the edges of the clouds tinged with gold. She looked back at the small wooden house and felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Not the fleeting kind that came from closing a deal, but the lasting kind that came from knowing a choice would change more than just numbers on a balance sheet. Mary stepped out onto the porch then, standing beside her. "I still can't believe you came back," she said quietly. "I told you I would," Olivia replied, "and I meant it." They stood there in silence for a moment, watching the wind stir the leaves along the gravel drive, both knowing that the next time they stood here together, the house and their lives would look very different. Mary closed the front door behind the last of Olivia's advisors, her hand still resting on the worn brass handle, as if she needed the solid feel of it to steady herself. The room had gone quiet again, the voices and measured tones of business gone with the car that now rolled away down the gravel drive. Jacob's laughter floated faintly from his room in the back, where Olivia had briefly greeted him before the boy went back to his toys, unaware of the scale of the conversation that had just taken place. Mary walked to the sofa and sat down, her hands resting in her lap. She stared for a long moment at the coffee table, where Olivia's mug had sat the night of the storm. The memory of that evening so vivid it might have been yesterday. It seemed impossible that less than a week ago she had opened her door to a stranger, someone shivering in the rain with no guarantee of help in sight. Now that same person had returned in a polished car with a small entourage, offering a promise that could change her and her son's future entirely. Her first reaction, the one she had barely managed to voice, had been to refuse. It was instinctive. Over the years she had learned that nothing came without a price, and offers that seemed too generous often carried the heaviest burdens. But Olivia's eyes had held no trace of pity or condescension. The offer had been clear, deliberate, and above all, sincere. Still, the enormity of it sat heavy on her chest. She rose and moved to the small kitchen, filling the kettle and setting it on the stove. The familiar motions of making tea helped settle her, grounding her in something she could control. As the water heated, she looked out the window over the sink. The yard was littered with branches and damp leaves from the storm. The house itself bore its usual signs of wear: the sagging porch rail, the chipped paint near the eaves, the narrow window frames that let in more cold than they should come winter. All those things, Olivia had said, would be repaired, replaced, made new. Mary tried to imagine it. She thought of Jacob running across the porch without worrying about loose boards, of a roof that didn't leak during heavy rain, of windows that kept the frost at bay. She thought of the trust fund Olivia had described, a future where her son could choose his path without being chained by cost. It was a future she had never dared to picture in detail because the imagining hurt more than the reality of doing without. The kettle whistled, pulling her back from her thoughts. She poured the water over the tea bag, watching the amber swirl spread through the cup. She carried it to the table and sat, hands curled around the ceramic for warmth. When Olivia had spoken, there had been no hesitation in her voice, no hint of uncertainty about whether she should be doing this. Mary had seen wealthy people before, mostly from a distance, passing through town or stopping briefly in the diner where she worked mornings. Most carried themselves with a practiced detachment, a kind of invisible barrier that kept them apart from everyone else. Olivia was different. Even that first night dripping from the rain, there had been something unguarded in her, a willingness to be present without measuring every interaction. Mary sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth spread through her. She was not a woman easily swayed by promises. Life had taught her to measure words against actions, to wait and see if what was said in the light of one moment held true in the shadow of another. But something told her Olivia meant every word she had spoken on the porch. In the quiet, she replayed the exchange. "You didn't ask for credentials, you didn't ask for anything in return," Olivia had said. "You just opened your door." It had struck Mary in a way she hadn't expected. She had never considered that act extraordinary. It was simply what she believed decent people should do. But Olivia had looked at her as though she'd done something rare. She thought about Jacob again. She had spent his whole life calculating what they could afford, weighing one need against another, making compromises that a 6-year-old couldn't possibly see. If she accepted Olivia's help, those calculations might change. There might be space for choices she had long dismissed as impossible. Yet with that came the fear of what it meant to accept something so substantial from someone outside her world. The sound of the gravel crunching outside pulled her from her thoughts. She stood and stepped to the window in time to see Olivia's car disappearing around the bend in the road, the sunlight glinting off its polished surface. Mary stayed there for a long moment, one hand braced on the window frame, the other holding the cooling cup of tea. Her life had always been measured in small, steady steps, saving enough to replace a broken appliance, finding a way to stretch a paycheck when something unexpected happened, keeping the house patched together just enough to make it through another season. Now someone had offered to leap her forward by years in a single gesture. It was more than she had ever asked for, more than she had let herself dream about. She took a slow breath and let it out. Shock still rippled through her, but beneath it something quieter was beginning to take shape. Not quite relief, not quite joy, but the first fragile thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, this was real. She set her cup down, straightened her shoulders, and turned toward the hallway where Jacob's voice was calling. Whatever else the future held, she knew one thing: their lives had already begun to change. The weeks that followed moved with a pace Mary had never experienced. For as long as she could remember, change in her life had been slow, measured in inches. A repaired porch step here, a repainted wall there, small efforts made when time and money allowed. But now, each day brought visible transformation. Trucks arrived early in the morning, their engines rumbling down the gravel drive, carrying supplies she had only ever seen in hardware store displays or on the glossy pages of home magazines. The construction crew worked methodically, their voices filling the air with a mix of instructions, laughter, and the rhythmic sounds of saws, hammers, and drills. At first, Mary found herself uneasy with so many people moving through her home, dismantling and rebuilding the spaces that had shaped her life. Yet as the days passed, she saw the care in their work, the way they reinforced the porch railing, ensuring Jacob could lean against it without fear, the precision with which they fitted new windows that sealed tightly against the cold. Olivia visited often, arriving in the same sleek car but never with the imposing entourage she had brought that first day. She came alone or with one advisor at most, walking the property with Mary, listening to her preferences, making sure every decision felt like hers. "This is your home," Olivia reminded her more than once. "I'm just making sure it's as strong and comfortable as it should be." The renovations spread from the obvious repairs into changes Mary had never imagined possible. The roof was replaced with sturdy, weather-resistant shingles. The kitchen, once cramped and dim, was opened with a new window that let in the morning light. A second-hand stove, which had served her faithfully for years but often needed coaxing to work, was replaced with a new model that heated evenly and without complaint. The living room floor, warped from years of damp winters, was leveled and finished in warm oak tones. For Jacob, the changes were magic. His small bedroom, which had always been functional but plain, was transformed into a space that reflected his imagination. Shelves for his books, a bright quilt in colors he chose himself, a sturdy desk where he could draw or do homework. Mary caught him more than once sitting cross-legged on his bed, just looking around the room with a small private smile. Beyond the house itself, Olivia made good on her other promise. Papers were drawn up, meetings held, signatures added to official documents. Mary met with a representative from the financial firm Olivia trusted, a woman who explained the trust in clear, patient terms. The account was set up in Jacob's name, secured until he reached adulthood, with enough to ensure that when the time came, the choice of where and how to study would be his alone. It was a kind of security Mary had never dared hope for. For years she had measured her decisions against a tight budget, calculating which bills could wait a week, which purchases could be delayed until the next paycheck. Now, for the first time, she could think ahead without the sharp edge of anxiety. She still worked, the diner in the mornings, the cleaning job in the evenings, because work was part of who she was. But she no longer felt the same crushing weight pressing against her with each passing day. Olivia, for her part, seemed changed as well. Though she still moved easily in her world of luxury and influence, Mary noticed a new ease in her when she visited. She asked about the small details, how the new windows handled the wind at night, whether the kitchen felt warmer in the mornings, and listened closely to the answers. She stayed for coffee more often than not, sitting at the kitchen table without rushing to her next appointment. One afternoon, as the final touches were being made to the new porch steps, Mary and Olivia stood side by side, watching the workers smooth the last coat of finish. The air carried the crisp scent of autumn, and a faint breeze sent a scatter of leaves across the yard. "You've given us more than a house," Mary said quietly, her gaze still on the steps. "You've given me space to breathe. That's not something I've had in a long time." Olivia glanced at her, the corners of her mouth softening into a smile. "You gave me something first, Mary. You reminded me that kindness can exist without a ledger keeping track of it. I didn't want to forget that." Mary shook her head slightly, still marveling at how their paths had crossed at all. "I can't imagine what would have happened if I'd kept the door shut that night." "I can," Olivia said, her voice firm, "and I'm glad you didn't." When the work was finally complete, the house stood renewed yet still itself. The weathered charm remained, the same siding cleaned and reinforced, the same familiar layout, but now it carried the assurance of strength beneath the surface. It was a home ready for storms to come, a home that could shelter not only against the wind and rain, but against the constant wear of time and struggle. That first evening after the crew left for good, Mary and Jacob sat on the new porch, wrapped in a shared blanket as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, but the wind no longer rattled the windows or crept through unseen cracks. Inside, the lights glowed warmly, steady and reliable. For Mary, it was more than just a renovated house. It was the start of a chapter she had never thought she would write, one in which the future felt open, in which she could meet each day without the shadow of uncertainty always at her back. And as she watched her son's eyes grow heavy with sleep beside her, she knew with quiet certainty that the kindness she had offered on that stormy night had come back to her in ways she could never have imagined. The first winter after the renovations arrived with early snow. Thick flakes drifted from the grey sky, settling over the yard and resting on the newly repaired roof in a soft, pristine layer. Inside, the warmth held steady, the sound of the wind reduced to a distant whisper behind insulated walls and sealed windows. Mary moved through her home with a calm she had never known during the cold months, no longer bracing for the sudden leaks, the drafty corners, or the creak of wood under strain from heavy frost. Jacob thrived in the comfort of the new space. His room stayed warm at night, and he could sit at his desk by the window, drawing or reading without needing to bundle up in layers. He had started talking about the future in ways that made Mary pause. Not in vague daydreams, but with concrete ideas. He wanted to study engineering, he said one evening over dinner, so he could build things that lasted. The trust Olivia had established meant that these dreams could grow without being pruned by the limits of what Mary could afford. Olivia continued to visit, sometimes announced, sometimes dropping by on her way through the area. Her sleek car looked almost out of place parked on the gravel drive, yet it had become a familiar sight to both Mary and Jacob. She would step out, carrying a paper bag from a bakery or a box of supplies she thought might be useful, always greeting them with the same quiet warmth she had shown that first night. Their conversations had deepened over time. In the beginning, they had spoken often about the house, the progress of the renovations, and the trust fund. Now they talked about other things. Books Jacob was reading, changes in the hotel industry, the way the seasons turned in the countryside. Olivia listened as Mary described the rhythms of her life, and Mary learned small details about Olivia's world of constant travel and decision-making. One evening in early spring, Olivia arrived just as the sun was setting. Mary was on the porch repairing the handle of a garden tool, while Jacob chased a ball across the yard. The air smelled faintly of earth and new grass. Olivia joined her on the steps, watching Jacob with an expression that held a touch of wonder. "He's grown," Olivia said softly. "They do that," Mary replied with a smile, "faster than you're ready for." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sky deepening into shades of gold and lavender. Finally, Mary set the tool aside and turned to face Olivia. "I've been meaning to tell you something. I know you've heard me say thank you before, but it never feels like enough. What you did here is, for me, for Jacob. It's not just about the house or the money. You gave us peace of mind that's worth more than I can measure." Olivia met her gaze steadily. "And you gave me something I couldn't measure either. That night when I was walking in the storm, I wasn't just cold and wet. I was untethered, always moving, always chasing the next thing, and for what? You opened your door and reminded me what it's like to stop, to be welcomed without expectation. You think I changed your life, but you changed mine first." Mary studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why it worked. We both needed something we didn't know we were missing." Olivia's lips curved into a faint smile. "Exactly." As the months passed, their friendship became something steady, a thread woven into both their lives. Olivia invited Mary and Jacob to Boston once, not for a grand event, but simply to spend a weekend together. She showed Jacob the harbor, took him to a science museum, and let him explore the hotel kitchens where chefs prepared intricate meals. Mary saw Olivia in her own world, moving with quiet authority, but also with a softness that came out more readily now than it had before. Back in the countryside, Mary found herself looking forward to Olivia's visits. Sometimes they were brief, sometimes they lasted hours, but each carried the same sense of ease. They could talk or sit in silence, and either felt natural. Jacob grew comfortable enough to tease Olivia, in the way children do when they trust someone implicitly, and she accepted it with good humor. One autumn afternoon, as they sat in the kitchen with coffee, Olivia looked around the room, the sunlight catching on the polished floor, the shelves neatly arranged, the stove humming quietly. "It's strange," she said. "This place feels more like home to me than my own house sometimes." Mary tilted her head. "Maybe it's because here you're not working, you're just being." Olivia considered that, then nodded. Maybe so. The years ahead would hold their share of challenges, for Mary, for Jacob, for Olivia, but the connection forged on that stormy night remained a constant. It was not bound by debt or obligation, but by mutual respect and a recognition of the humanity they had found in each other. In time, when Jacob graduated from university, Olivia was there in the crowd, clapping as loudly as anyone. And years after that, when Olivia stepped away from the relentless pace of her corporate role, she found herself spending more time at the wooden house in the countryside, sitting on the porch with Mary as the sun dipped low, their conversations meandering like the gravel road beyond the yard. They never forgot how it had begun, a night of wind and rain, locked doors, and one that opened without hesitation. In the end, both women knew that the shelter found that night had been more than physical. It had been the beginning of a shared understanding, a lasting reminder that sometimes, in the midst of life's storms, the smallest act of kindness can change everything. As the seasons turned over and over, the gratitude between them never dulled. It wasn't spoken every time they met, but it was present in every shared glance, every easy conversation, every moment of unhurried company. In that quiet, enduring way, both Olivia and Mary carried the certainty that they had found something rare, a friendship built not on what either had to give, but on what they had come to mean to each other. And on evenings when the rain returned, drumming softly against the roof, they would sit together and remember, not with the sharp edge of that night's fear, but with the steady warmth of knowing that once upon a storm, they had each found a home in the other.